Mike Rodriguez had always been proud of his front lawn. After 15 years of living in the Meadowbrook subdivision, he had transformed what was once patchy grass into a pristine carpet of emerald green. Every Saturday morning you could find him out there with his mower, trimming the edges with surgical precision, applying fertilizer with the care of a master gardener. His neighbors often complimented the lawn, and Mike took genuine pride in maintaining what many considered the best-looking yard on Elm Street. The Meadowbrook subdivision was one of those planned communities that had sprung up in the early 2000s, complete with curved streets, matching mailboxes, and a homeowners association that governed everything from fence heights to acceptable paint colors. Mike had served on the HOA board twice and understood the importance of maintaining property values through community standards. He believed in following rules and expected his neighbors to do the same. Everything changed the day the Hendersons moved in next door. Tom Henderson was a successful contractor in his early 40s, driving a massive pickup truck that barely fit in his driveway. His wife Sarah seemed pleasant enough, always waving from their kitchen window, but Tom had an attitude that rubbed Mike the wrong way from the beginning. During their first conversation over the fence, Tom had made it clear that he thought HOA rules were nothing more than suggestions for people with too much time on their hands. The trouble started small, as these things often do. Mike noticed tire marks on his lawn near the property line where Tom had been backing his truck out. When Mike mentioned it politely, Tom shrugged and said accidents happen. But the tire marks kept appearing and they were getting deeper. Mike realized that Tom was deliberately cutting across the corner of his lawn because it was easier than backing straight out of his own driveway. Mike tried to handle the situation diplomatically. He approached Tom on a Sunday afternoon while both men were working in their yards. Tom was pressure washing his driveway and Mike waited for him to turn off the machine before walking over with a friendly smile. "Hey Tom, I wanted to talk to you about something," Mike said, keeping his voice casual and neighborly. "I've noticed some tire tracks on my lawn, and I think it might be happening when you're backing out of your driveway." Tom barely looked up from coiling his pressure washer hose. "Yeah, maybe. Hard to see everything when you're backing up a big truck." "I understand," Mike replied, still maintaining his diplomatic tone. "Maybe you could just be a little more careful? I spend a lot of time working on that grass, and those ruts are pretty deep." Tom finally looked at him directly, and Mike didn't like what he saw in the man's eyes. "Look, Mike, it's just grass. It grows back. Maybe you should worry less about your precious lawn and more about real problems." Mike felt his jaw clench, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm just asking you to stay on your own property when you're driving. That's not unreasonable." "Tell you what," Tom said, turning his back to coil the hose. "I'll try to be more careful. But sometimes these things happen between neighbors, part of living in a community." Mike walked back to his house feeling frustrated but hoping the conversation had made a difference. He had tried to handle it the right way, neighbor to neighbor, without involving the HOA or making a big scene. Surely Tom would respect that and make an effort to avoid his lawn in the future. But the tire marks continued. In fact, they seemed to get worse. Mike began to suspect that Tom was actually driving across his lawn more frequently, not less. The ruts were deeper and they extended further into his property. When Mike looked out his front window in the mornings, he could see the damage clearly marked in his once perfect grass. Mike decided to document everything. He took photos of the tire tracks with his phone, noting the date and time. He measured how far the ruts extended into his property. He even set up a small security camera in his front window to record any incidents. What he captured on video made his blood boil. Tom wasn't accidentally clipping his lawn while backing out. The man was deliberately driving across Mike's property because it was faster and easier than using his own driveway properly. The video showed Tom's truck making a sharp left turn directly across the lawn, cutting through Mike's carefully maintained grass to reach the street. He was treating Mike's property like his personal shortcut. Armed with photographic evidence, Mike approached Tom again. This time, he wasn't feeling quite so diplomatic. He waited until Tom came home from work one evening and walked over to his neighbor's truck as Tom was getting out. "Tom, we need to talk," Mike said firmly. "I have video footage of you driving across my lawn. This isn't an accident and it needs to stop immediately." Tom's response surprised Mike with its hostility. "Are you seriously spying on me now? What kind of neighbor sets up cameras to watch other neighbors?" "The kind of neighbor who's tired of having his property damaged," Mike shot back. "I have clear evidence that you're deliberately driving across my lawn. I'm asking you one more time to stop. Tom slammed his truck door harder than necessary. You know what your problem is, Mike. You take yourself way too seriously. It's a patch of grass, not the White House lawn. Maybe if you got a real hobby instead of obsessing over every blade of grass, you'd be happier. This is my property, Mike said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. You have no right to drive across it, and you know it. Sue me, Tom replied with a smirk as he walked toward his front door. Oh, wait, you'd probably call the HOA first, wouldn't you? Go ahead. I'm sure they'll send me a strongly worded letter. Mike stood in Tom's driveway, watching his neighbor disappear into his house, and felt something shift inside him. He had tried being reasonable. He had tried being diplomatic. He had given Tom multiple opportunities to do the right thing. But Tom had made it clear that he had no intention of showing any respect for Mike's property or rights as a neighbor. That night, Mike lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Tom thought he could get away with this because he assumed Mike would just complain to the HOA, and nothing would really happen. He was probably right about that. The HOA was notorious for being slow to act, and property line disputes were always complicated. Tom was counting on Mike being too passive, too rule-following, too concerned about maintaining neighborhood harmony to take any real action. But Tom Henderson had seriously underestimated his neighbor. Mike had spent 15 years building his reputation as someone who cared about his property and his community. He wasn't about to let some arrogant contractor walk all over him, literally or figuratively. If Tom wanted to play games, Mike was ready to show him what happens when you mess with the wrong neighbor's lawn. Mike's first step was to research exactly what his legal rights were as a property owner. He spent hours online reading about property line laws, trespassing statutes, and homeowner remedies for neighbor disputes. What he discovered gave him confidence that he was absolutely in the right. Tom's repeated driving across his lawn constituted trespassing, and Mike had every legal right to protect his property. The more Mike researched, the more he realized that Tom had picked the wrong person to mess with. Mike worked as an operations manager for a logistics company, and his job required him to be detail-oriented, methodical, and persistent when solving problems. These same skills would serve him well in dealing with his problematic neighbor. Mike decided to give Tom one final, formal warning before escalating the situation. He drafted a certified letter outlining the problem, referencing the specific HOA covenants that Tom was violating, and requesting that all vehicle traffic remain on Tom's own property. He included several of his best photographs showing the tire damage and made it clear that he had video evidence of the trespassing. The letter was professional but firm, giving Tom exactly 7 days to acknowledge the complaint and confirm that the lawn driving would stop permanently. Tom's response came not in writing, but in action. The very next morning after the certified letter was delivered, Mike watched from his kitchen window as Tom deliberately drove his truck in an even wider arc across the lawn, tearing up fresh sections of grass that had never been damaged before. It was clearly intentional, a middle finger directed at Mike's formal complaint. Mike felt his anger spike, but he forced himself to think strategically. Tom was escalating the situation, which meant Mike needed to be smarter, not angrier. He reviewed his options carefully. He could call the police, but property line disputes were usually handled as civil matters unless there was significant property damage. He could file a complaint with the HOA, but that process could take months and might not result in any meaningful consequences. He could hire a lawyer, but legal action would be expensive and time-consuming, or he could take matters into his own hands. The idea came to him while he was researching property protection methods online. Many homeowners use decorative barriers to protect their landscaping from vehicle damage. Garden borders, decorative stones, small fences, and landscape timbers were all perfectly legal ways to define property lines and prevent accidental intrusions. But Mike wasn't thinking about prevention anymore. He was thinking about consequences. Mike made a trip to the local home improvement store and spent considerable time in the landscaping section. He examined different types of barriers considering their visibility, durability, and potential effectiveness. He settled on a combination that would serve his purposes perfectly. Heavy landscape timbers buried just deep enough to be stable, positioned strategically along the route that Tom's truck typically took across his lawn. The beauty of his plan was its complete legality. Mike was installing landscape barriers on his own property, well within his property lines. If someone happened to drive across his lawn and encounter these barriers, that was their fault for trespassing. He wasn't setting any traps or doing anything dangerous. He was simply protecting his landscaping with appropriate materials. Mike worked carefully and methodically. He used a metal detector to make sure he wouldn't hit any buried utility lines. And he called the city's utility marking service to be absolutely certain. He measured twice and dug once, creating a series of holes along the path that Tom's truck habitually followed. The landscape timbers were heavy treated lumber, 8 feet long and 6 inches square, buried 2 feet deep with 6 feet extending above ground. But Mike's real stroke of genius was in the positioning. He didn't place the timbers where they would be immediately visible from Tom's driveway. Instead, he positioned them along the path that Tom's truck followed, once it was already committed to driving across the lawn. Someone driving legally down the street would never encounter them. But someone cutting across Mike's property would find them directly in their path. Mike also installed the timbers at night, working by flashlight in his own yard. He had every right to landscape his property whenever he wanted, but he preferred to avoid questions from other neighbors until his project was complete. By morning, the timbers were in place, and Mike had spread fresh mulch around their bases to make them look like intentional landscaping elements. The timbers weren't immediately obvious from the street, especially since Mike had chosen naturally weathered lumber that blended with his existing landscape design. But they were substantial enough to stop a truck, and positioned precisely where Tom's vehicle would encounter them if he continued his habit of driving across the lawn. Mike spent the next few days maintaining his normal routine while secretly watching for Tom's reaction. He continued to document everything with his security camera, and he made sure to follow his usual lawn care schedule. If anyone asked, he was simply protecting his landscaping with appropriate barriers, which was both true and completely reasonable. Tom's first encounter with the new landscape features happened on a Thursday morning. Mike was getting ready for work when he heard the sound of a truck engine revving, followed by a loud thud and the screech of brakes. He looked out his front window to see Tom's truck stopped awkwardly on his lawn. The front bumper pressed against one of the landscape timbers. Mike watched as Tom got out of his truck to assess the situation. Even from a distance, Mike could see his neighbor's face turning red as he realized what had happened. Tom walked around the timber, examining it carefully, clearly understanding that this wasn't some accident or coincidence. He looked toward Mike's house with an expression of pure fury, but Mike was already heading out his back door to leave for work. When Mike returned home that evening, he found a handwritten note taped to his front door. Tom's message was short and direct. "Move those logs or I'll move them for you." Mike carefully photographed the note and filed it away with his other documentation. Tom had just threatened to damage Mike's property, which was exactly the kind of escalation that Mike could use to his advantage if needed. But the landscape timbers stayed exactly where Mike had placed them. That weekend, he added a few more decorative elements to his front yard landscaping, including some attractive plants and a small border fence that happened to make the timbers look even more intentional. He was creating a comprehensive property protection system that was both effective and completely legitimate. Mike also noticed that Tom had started parking his truck differently, angling it in his driveway to get a better view of Mike's front yard before backing out. Tom was clearly studying the new obstacles, trying to figure out how to navigate around them. But Mike had positioned the timbers carefully, making it impossible to drive across the lawn without encountering at least one of them. The psychological warfare had begun in earnest. Tom knew that Mike had outmaneuvered him, but he also knew that the timbers were perfectly legal landscape features on Mike's own property. Tom couldn't complain to the HOA about Mike's landscaping choices, and he certainly couldn't remove barriers from someone else's property without committing vandalism. Mike was winning, and both men knew it. But Tom Henderson wasn't the type of person to accept defeat gracefully. Mike had solved his immediate problem, but he had also created a new one. His neighbor was now actively hostile, and Mike suspected that Tom would try to find some way to retaliate. The question was what form that retaliation would take, and whether Mike was prepared for whatever Tom might do next. As Mike watered his plants that Sunday evening, carefully tending to his new landscaping, he couldn't help but feel satisfied with his handiwork. His lawn was finally safe from Tom's truck, and he had accomplished his goal without breaking any laws or violating any community standards. He had simply exercised his right to protect his property, and if Tom didn't like the consequences of his own behavior, that was Tom's problem to solve. Tom's retaliation came sooner than Mike expected, and it was more creative than he had anticipated. Mike discovered the first sign of trouble on Monday morning when he went out to get his newspaper. Someone had scattered dog waste across his front walkway during the night, and the smell was unmistakably fresh. Mike looked around the neighborhood but saw no evidence of any dogs, and none of his immediate neighbors owned pets large enough to produce waste of that quantity. Mike cleaned up the mess and installed a motion-activated floodlight near his front door. He also expanded his security camera coverage to include his entire front yard and walkway. If Tom wanted to play dirty games, Mike would make sure he had evidence of every incident. The harassment escalated over the next 2 weeks. Mike's morning newspaper began disappearing regularly, even though the delivery person confirmed it was being delivered. His garbage cans were mysteriously tipped over on pickup days, spilling trash across his driveway. Someone started parking a beat-up old car on the street directly in front of Mike's house, blocking his view and making his property look less attractive. Mike documented everything but didn't immediately respond. He was learning Tom's patterns and building a case for harassment. Meanwhile, the landscape timbers continued to protect his lawn perfectly. Tom had been forced to use his own driveway properly, and Mike's grass was finally recovering from months of damage. The situation reached a new level when Mike received a formal complaint from the HOA. According to the letter, an anonymous neighbor had reported that Mike's landscape timbers violated community standards because they were unsightly and not in keeping with the aesthetic character of the neighborhood. The HOA was requesting that Mike remove the timbers within 30 days or face potential fines. Mike knew exactly who had filed the anonymous complaint, but he also knew how to handle HOA bureaucracy. He had served on the board and understood that everything came down to documentation and following proper procedures. Mike immediately requested a formal hearing to contest the complaint, which was his right under the community bylaws. While preparing his defense, Mike discovered something interesting in the HOA covenants. The same rules that supposedly prohibited his landscape timbers also prohibited vehicles from crossing property lines and required all homeowners to maintain their landscaping in good condition. Tom had been violating these rules for months, and Mike had photographic evidence to prove it. Mike spent his evenings preparing for the HOA hearing like a lawyer preparing for trial. He organized his photographs chronologically, printed copies of relevant covenant sections, and prepared a detailed timeline of events. He also researched similar cases in other neighborhoods and found several precedents where homeowners had been allowed to install property protection barriers. The night before his hearing, Mike received an unexpected visit. Tom appeared at his front door around 8 o'clock, and for the first time since their dispute began, he seemed to want to have a reasonable conversation. "Look, Mike," Tom said, standing awkwardly on the front porch, "maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. I'm willing to be more careful about the lawn situation if you'll consider removing those timbers." Mike studied his neighbor's face carefully. Tom looked genuinely uncomfortable, which was unusual for someone who had seemed so confident and aggressive throughout their conflict. Mike suspected that Tom was worried about what might come out at the HOA hearing. "I appreciate you coming over," Mike replied diplomatically, "but those timbers aren't just about the lawn anymore. They're about property rights and mutual respect. You had multiple chances to handle this differently." "Come on, man," Tom said, his friendly facade slipping slightly. "Those things are an eyesore and you know it. The whole neighborhood is talking about this situation. The whole neighborhood has been watching you drive across my lawn for months," Mike countered. "If they're talking now, it's probably because they're wondering why it took me so long to do something about it." Tom's expression hardened. "This doesn't have to be complicated, Mike. I'm trying to offer you a reasonable solution here." "Your idea of reasonable and mine are very different," Mike said. "The timbers stay where they are. They're on my property, they're protecting my landscaping, and they're completely legal." "Fine," Tom said, his mask of reasonableness completely gone. "But don't expect this to end well for you. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Mike watched Tom walk back to his house and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Tom's final comment sounded less like frustration and more like a threat. Mike made a mental note to be extra vigilant about his property security. The HOA hearing took place in the community center conference room on a Thursday evening. Mike arrived early and was surprised to see Tom already there, sitting in the back row with a manila folder full of papers. Mike had expected Tom to avoid the hearing, since his own covenant violations would likely be discussed. The hearing board consisted of 3 current HOA officers, including the president, Sandra Walsh, whom Mike had worked with during his own time on the board. Mike felt confident that Sandra would give him a fair hearing. Regardless of the anonymous complaint, Mike presented his case methodically, starting with the timeline of Tom's trespassing and his own attempts to resolve the situation diplomatically. He showed photographs of the lawn damage, played portions of his security video, and read excerpts from Tom's threatening note. When he got to the part about installing the landscape timbers, he emphasized that they were a legitimate property protection measure, installed entirely on his own land. The timbers serve multiple purposes, Mike explained to the board. They prevent further vehicle damage to my landscaping. They clearly mark my property line, and they're consistent with other landscape barriers used throughout our community. Sandra Walsh nodded thoughtfully. Have you considered other alternatives that might be less visually prominent? I researched many options, Mike replied, but the timbers were specifically chosen because they're effective, durable, and appropriate for the location. The damage to my lawn was extensive and expensive to repair. When Mike finished his presentation, Sandra asked if anyone else wanted to speak about the issue. Tom stood up and walked to the front of the room, carrying his manila folder. I'd like to address some of the accusations that have been made tonight, Tom began. Mr. Rodriguez has painted a very one-sided picture of this situation. Tom's presentation was smooth and well-prepared, which surprised Mike. Tom claimed that any lawn damage had been accidental and minimal, that Mike had been unreasonable and confrontational from the beginning, and that the landscape timbers were a deliberate attempt to create neighborhood conflict. These barriers are positioned specifically to cause problems, Tom argued. They're not decorative landscaping features. They're obstacles designed to damage vehicles and create liability issues for the community. Tom also produced photographs of his own, showing the timbers from various angles and arguing that they were unsightly and potentially dangerous. Mike had to admit that Tom had done his homework and was making his case effectively. But Tom made a crucial error when he started talking about Mike's obsessive behavior regarding his lawn. In trying to minimize the damage he had caused, Tom inadvertently admitted to driving across Mike's property multiple times. Sandra Walsh picked up on this immediately. Mr. Henderson, she interrupted, are you saying that you have driven across Mr. Rodriguez's lawn on multiple occasions? Tom realized his mistake but couldn't back down without contradicting his entire argument. Well, yes, but it was never intentional damage. Sometimes when you're backing up a large vehicle, these things happen. Sandra made a note on her pad. And how many times would you estimate this has happened? Tom was trapped. If he said it was rare, his argument about Mike being unreasonable would fall apart. If he admitted it was frequent, he would be confessing to repeated trespassing. I don't keep count, Tom said finally. But Mr. Rodriguez is making this sound much worse than it actually was. Mike watched Tom's credibility crumble in real time. The hearing board could see exactly what kind of neighbor they were dealing with. And Tom's smooth presentation couldn't hide the fundamental fact that he had repeatedly trespassed on someone else's property. When the hearing ended, Sandra told both men that the board would review all the evidence and render a decision within 2 weeks. But Mike could tell from her expression that the decision had essentially already been made. Tom's admission had sealed his fate. The HOA board's decision arrived in Mike's mailbox exactly 2 weeks later. The envelope was thick, which Mike took as a good sign, and when he opened it, his satisfaction was complete. Not only had the board rejected the anonymous complaint about his landscape timbers, but they had also initiated a formal violation proceeding against Tom Henderson for multiple covenant violations. The letter detailed the board's findings in clear, official language. Tom was being cited for property line encroachment, failure to maintain respectful neighbor relations, and creating conditions that damaged community property values. The board had reviewed Mike's evidence thoroughly and found his security footage particularly compelling. Tom had 30 days to submit a written response and compliance plan, or face escalating fines starting at $200 per month. Even better from Mike's perspective, The board had ruled that his landscape timbers were not only acceptable, but actually commendable as a property protection measure. The letter praised Mike for his proactive approach to maintaining property values and community standards, and suggested that other homeowners might benefit from similar landscaping improvements. Mike celebrated quietly that evening, with a beer on his back patio, admiring his protected front lawn. The grass had almost completely recovered from Tom's damage, and the timbers had proven 100% effective at preventing any further vehicle intrusions. He had won his battle through patience, documentation, and strategic thinking, but Mike's satisfaction was short-lived. Tom's response to the HOA ruling was swift and vindictive. The harassment that had been annoying but manageable suddenly became serious and potentially dangerous. It started with Mike's car. On the Monday morning after the HOA decision was delivered, Mike discovered 4 flat tires on his sedan. There was no obvious sign of vandalism, no visible punctures or slashing, but all 4 tires were completely deflated. When Mike had them inspected at a tire shop, the mechanic found tiny puncture holes that could only have been made deliberately with a small, sharp tool. Mike immediately suspected Tom but had no way to prove it. His security cameras covered his front yard and walkway, but his car was parked in his driveway, partially out of view. Mike filed a police report and submitted an insurance claim, but he also knew that Tom was smart enough to avoid leaving evidence. The tire incident was just the beginning. Over the next week, Mike's home email account was mysteriously subscribed to dozens of spam mailing lists. His credit card numbers were somehow compromised, leading to fraudulent charges that he had to dispute. Someone called in false service requests to multiple utility companies, causing Mike to miss work dealing with confused technicians who showed up at his house for appointments he hadn't made. Most disturbing of all, Mike started receiving phone calls at work from people claiming to be responding to classified ads that he had supposedly placed. According to the callers, Mike was selling everything from furniture to electronics at suspiciously low prices, and his work number was listed as the contact. When Mike investigated, he discovered that someone had posted fake ads on multiple online marketplaces using his name, address, and work phone number. Mike realized that Tom was waging a sophisticated campaign of harassment designed to disrupt every aspect of his life. The attacks were careful and calculated, always staying just below the threshold that would trigger serious police involvement. Tom was making Mike's life miserable while maintaining plausible deniability. But Tom had underestimated Mike's resolve and resourcefulness. Mike had spent his entire career solving complex logistical problems, and he approached Tom's harassment campaign like any other puzzle that needed to be solved. He started by changing all his passwords and implementing better security measures for his online accounts. He contacted the websites where fake ads had been posted and had them removed while setting up alerts to catch any new postings. Mike also expanded his surveillance system significantly. He installed additional cameras to cover his driveway and the sides of his house, and he upgraded to a system that stored footage in the cloud where it couldn't be tampered with. He started parking his car in different locations and varying his daily routines to make himself a more difficult target. Most importantly, Mike began building a comprehensive case file documenting the escalating harassment. He saved screenshots of every fake online posting, kept records of every suspicious phone call, and maintained detailed logs of every incident. He was creating the kind of evidence trail that would be valuable if he ever needed to involve law enforcement or pursue legal action. Mike's methodical approach began paying off when he caught Tom in the act. One of his new security cameras captured footage of Tom sneaking around the side of Mike's house at 2 a.m, carrying what appeared to be a small electronic device. The image quality wasn't perfect due to the darkness, but it was clearly Tom, and the timestamp provided proof of trespassing. The next morning, Mike discovered that someone had placed a small Bluetooth speaker in the bushes near his bedroom window. The device had been programmed to play random loud noises at irregular intervals throughout the night, designed to disrupt his sleep. It was a clever form of harassment that would have been nearly impossible to detect without the security footage showing how it got there. Mike had finally caught Tom red-handed, but he decided not to immediately confront his neighbor or call the police. Instead, he saw an opportunity to turn Tom's own tactics against him. Mike left the speaker where it was but disabled it, and he began planning a more comprehensive response to Tom's harassment campaign. Mike spent the weekend researching Tom's background and discovered some interesting information. Tom Henderson wasn't just a contractor. He was a licensed contractor who depended on his professional reputation to maintain his business. Any criminal charges or legal problems could potentially affect his licensing and his ability to work on major projects. Mike also discovered that Tom had been involved in similar neighbor disputes in his previous neighborhood. A careful search of public records revealed that Tom had been sued twice by former neighbors over property damage and harassment issues. The pattern was clear. Tom was a serial bad neighbor who used intimidation and harassment to get his way. Armed with this new information, Mike began developing a strategy that would end Tom's harassment campaign permanently. He wasn't just going to defend himself anymore. He was going to take the offensive and make sure that Tom faced real consequences for his behavior. Mike started by contacting Tom's previous neighbors and learning about their experiences. Both families were eager to share their stories and provide documentation of Tom's past behavior. One former neighbor even offered to serve as a witness if Mike decided to pursue legal action. Mike also researched Tom's business and discovered that he was currently working on several large construction projects in the area. These projects required him to maintain his professional licenses and insurance, both of which could be affected by criminal charges or civil judgments. The pieces of Mike's counterattack were falling into place. He had evidence of Tom's current harassment campaign, documentation of his past bad behavior, and knowledge of Tom's professional vulnerabilities. Mike was preparing to show Tom Henderson what happened when you escalated a conflict with someone who was smarter, more patient, and more thorough than you were. But first, Mike wanted to give Tom one final opportunity to back down. He was going to make it clear to Tom that continuing the harassment campaign would result in consequences that could destroy Tom's business and reputation. Mike hoped that Tom would be smart enough to recognize when he was beaten, but he was prepared for the possibility that Tom's ego wouldn't allow him to surrender. Either way, Mike was confident that the conflict was approaching its conclusion. Tom had pushed him too far and made the situation too personal. Now it was time for Tom to learn that actions have consequences, and some neighbors fight back harder than others. Mike's final warning to Tom came in the form of a certified letter that was part olive branch and part ultimatum. The letter was professionally written and legally precise, outlining every incident of harassment that Mike had documented, including the security footage of Tom trespassing on his property. Mike made it clear that he had evidence linking Tom to the tire slashing, the fake online ads, the utility service calls, and the Bluetooth speaker incident. But the letter also offered Tom a way out. Mike proposed a simple agreement. If Tom ceased all harassment immediately and signed a written commitment to respect property boundaries, Mike would not pursue criminal charges or file complaints with Tom's professional licensing board. The offer would expire in exactly 72 hours. Mike hand-delivered the letter to make sure Tom received it, and he made sure his security cameras captured the entire interaction. Tom opened the door wearing a confident smirk that faded quickly as he read the first page of Mike's documentation. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you?" Tom said after skimming through the evidence packet. "Smart enough," Mike replied calmly. "The question is whether you're smart enough to take the deal." Tom's face cycled through several emotions as he continued reading. Mike could see the moment when Tom realized how much evidence Mike had gathered and how serious the potential consequences were. "This is blackmail," Tom said finally. "This is a settlement offer," Mike corrected. "You can end this situation right now by signing an agreement to be a respectful neighbor, or you can face the consequences of your actions through the legal system. Your choice." Mike walked back to his house, leaving Tom standing in his doorway with the letter. The next 72 hours would determine whether Tom was capable of making rational decisions or if his ego would drive him to continue fighting a battle he couldn't win. Tom's initial response came that same evening in the form of loud music played from his backyard until nearly midnight. It was a childish gesture of defiance that only strengthened Mike's case for ongoing harassment. Mike dutifully recorded the noise violation and added it to his evidence file. The second day brought a new escalation when Mike discovered that someone had poured used motor oil across his front sidewalk. The timing was clearly deliberate, done just before Mike left for work so that he would track the oil into his house and car. Mike photographed the mess thoroughly before cleaning it up, and he submitted the evidence to the police as part of an ongoing harassment report. On the third day, Tom's 72-hour deadline, Mike received an unexpected visitor. Sandra Walsh from the HOA board appeared at his door with a concerned expression and some disturbing news. "Mike, I wanted to give you a heads up about something," Sandra said. "Tom Henderson has filed a formal complaint against you with the board, and he's also been calling individual board members trying to lobby against you." Mike invited Sandra inside and offered her coffee while she explained the situation. According to Sandra, Tom was claiming that Mike had threatened him and was using his HOA connections to harass innocent neighbors. Tom was demanding that the board reverse its previous decision and force Mike to remove his landscape timbers. "He's also spreading stories around the neighborhood," Sandra continued. "He's telling people that you're some kind of obsessive troublemaker who's making everyone's lives difficult." Mike showed Sandra his complete evidence file, including the security footage of Tom placing the Bluetooth speaker and the documentation of all the harassment incidents. Sandra's eyes widened as she reviewed the material. "My God, Mike," she said, "this is way beyond a simple neighbor dispute. This man is systematically harassing you." "That's why I gave him the settlement offer," Mike explained. "I was hoping he'd be smart enough to cut his losses and move on." Sandra shook her head. "Based on what he's been telling board members, I don't think he's planning to accept your offer. He seems to think he can manipulate the system and turn the community against you." Mike felt his jaw tighten. Tom was not only rejecting the settlement offer, but actively trying to poison the neighborhood against him. It was time to move to the next phase of his plan. That evening, exactly 72 hours after delivering his ultimatum, Mike began executing his comprehensive response to Tom's harassment campaign. His first call was to the police department's non-emergency line, where he filed a formal criminal complaint for harassment, trespassing, and property damage. Mike's documentation was so thorough that the desk sergeant asked him if he worked in law enforcement. Mike's second call was to the state licensing board that governed contractors. He filed a formal complaint against Tom's professional license, citing criminal behavior that reflected poorly on his fitness to work in people's homes. The licensing board took such complaints seriously, especially when they involved harassment of clients or neighbors. Mike's third action was the most devastating. He contacted the general contractors and developers who were currently employing Tom on major projects. Mike didn't make accusations or demands. He simply provided factual information about the ongoing criminal investigation and professional licensing complaint. He let the companies draw their own conclusions about whether they wanted to continue working with someone who might become a legal liability. The response was swift and decisive. By the end of the week, Tom had been dropped from 2 major construction projects, and a third company had put his contract under review pending the outcome of the licensing investigation. Word travels fast in the construction industry, and Tom's reputation was being damaged exactly where it would hurt him most. But Mike wasn't finished. He had also been in contact with Tom's previous neighbors, and together they had compiled a comprehensive pattern of behavior that painted Tom as a serial bad neighbor. Mike shared this information with a local news reporter who specialized in consumer protection stories. The reporter was fascinated by the story of how one homeowner had successfully fought back against neighborhood harassment. Tom's public humiliation began when the local newspaper published a front-page story titled "When Good Neighbors Go Bad: How to Fight Back Against Harassment." The article detailed Tom's behavior without naming him directly, but included enough specific details that anyone in the neighborhood could identify him. The story also featured quotes from his previous neighbors and praised Mike's methodical approach to documenting and addressing the harassment. The newspaper story was picked up by local television stations and went viral on social media. Mike found himself being interviewed as an expert on dealing with difficult neighbors, while Tom became the poster child for bad neighbor behavior. The landscape timbers that had started the whole conflict were featured prominently in photographs as an example of creative property protection. Tom's response to his public embarrassment was predictably aggressive. He left angry voicemails on Mike's phone, accusing him of ruining his life and threatening to sue for defamation. But Tom's threats were empty. Everything Mike had shared with the media was factually accurate and well documented. The final blow came when Tom's homeowner's insurance company dropped his coverage after learning about the criminal harassment charges. Insurance companies don't like to cover clients who deliberately engage in behavior that creates liability risks. Without insurance, Tom couldn't work on most construction projects, effectively ending his business in the area. Mike watched Tom's world collapse with a mixture of satisfaction and genuine sympathy. He had never wanted the situation to escalate to this level, but Tom had forced his hand through his own stubborn refusal to act reasonably. Every consequence Tom was facing was a direct result of his own choices and behavior. The neighborhood dynamic shifted dramatically as word spread about what had really been happening. Neighbors who had initially been neutral or even slightly sympathetic to Tom now understood that Mike had been the victim of a sustained harassment campaign. Several neighbors approached Mike to apologize for not speaking up sooner and to offer their support if Tom tried to retaliate further. The HOA board held an emergency meeting to address Tom's complaint against Mike, but the meeting was largely a formality. With Tom's criminal charges and professional problems becoming public knowledge, his credibility was completely destroyed. The board not only rejected his complaint, but also voted to commend Mike for his handling of a difficult situation. Sandra Walsh personally delivered the board's decision to Mike, along with an unofficial warning that Tom was facing potential eviction proceedings if his behavior didn't improve dramatically. The community's homeowners' insurance rates could be affected by having a resident with ongoing legal problems, and the board had the authority to force the sale of properties that created liability issues for the community. Mike realized that Tom's situation had become so precarious that he might actually be forced to move away from the neighborhood entirely. It was a more complete victory than Mike had ever imagined possible when he first installed those landscape timbers to protect his lawn. As Mike stood in his front yard that weekend, watering his fully recovered grass and admiring his effective landscape barriers, he reflected on how dramatically the situation had changed. Tom's truck no longer posed any threat to his property, and Tom himself was facing consequences that would likely follow him for years to come. The conflict had taught Mike valuable lessons about standing up for himself and the importance of thorough documentation. But it had also shown him that some people will only respect boundaries when facing serious consequences for crossing them. Tom Henderson had learned this lesson the hard way, and his story would serve as a warning to future neighbors about the costs of harassment and intimidation. 6 months after the landscape timber installation that had started everything, Mike's life had returned to a peaceful normalcy that he had almost forgotten was possible. His front lawn was pristine once again, a testament to both his gardening skills and his determination to protect his property. The timber barriers had weathered beautifully, and now looked like they had always been part of his landscape design. Tom Henderson was gone from the neighborhood, though his departure hadn't been voluntary. The combination of criminal charges, professional licensing problems, and financial difficulties had forced him to sell his house quickly and at a significant loss. The new owners, a young couple with twin toddlers, had introduced themselves to Mike with fresh-baked cookies and genuine appreciation for having such a well-maintained property next door. Mike had watched Tom's moving truck leave on a gray Tuesday morning, feeling a complex mixture of relief and melancholy. He had never wanted the situation to escalate to the point where someone lost their home and livelihood, but Tom had made that outcome inevitable through his own poor choices. Mike had simply refused to be victimized, and Tom had paid the price for underestimating his neighbor's resolve. The criminal harassment charges had resulted in a plea bargain that included probation, community service, and a permanent restraining order. Tom was legally prohibited from contacting Mike or coming within 500 feet of his property, which effectively banned him from the entire neighborhood. The professional licensing complaint had been more damaging, resulting in a suspended license that would require extensive remedial training and supervision to restore. Mike's story had become something of a legend in the area, shared at neighborhood barbecues and HOA meetings as an example of how to handle difficult neighbors effectively. Several other homeowners had contacted Mike for advice about their own property disputes, and he had become an informal consultant on neighbor relations and property protection strategies. The local news coverage had brought Mike some unexpected opportunities. A home security company had offered him a consulting contract to help develop better residential surveillance systems. A law firm specializing in neighbor disputes had asked him to serve as an expert witness in similar cases. Mike had even been invited to speak at HOA conferences, about effective conflict resolution and documentation techniques. But the most satisfying outcome was the simple peace of mind that came from knowing his property was secure and his rights were respected. Mike could work in his garden without worrying about someone driving across his lawn. He could park his car in his driveway without fear of vandalism. He could sleep through the night without random noise disturbances or harassing phone calls. The landscape timbers had become a point of pride for Mike, representing not just property protection but personal empowerment. Several neighbors had installed similar barriers on their own properties, creating a trend that the HOA had officially endorsed as both attractive and practical. The timbers served as a visible reminder that property owners had the right to protect their investments and that bullies would face consequences for their behavior. Mike had also learned valuable lessons about the importance of community, relationships, and mutual support. The neighbors who had initially remained neutral during his conflict with Tom had later apologized and explained that they simply hadn't understood the full scope of what was happening. Many admitted that they had been intimidated by Tom's aggressive personality and had been reluctant to get involved in what they thought was a minor dispute. The experience had taught everyone in the neighborhood that remaining silent in the face of harassment actually enabled the behavior to continue and escalate. Several neighbors had formed an informal support network, sharing information about suspicious activities and offering to serve as witnesses if anyone faced similar problems in the future. Mike had also discovered that his methodical approach to documentation and evidence gathering was a skill that translated well to other areas of life. His employer had promoted him to a senior management position after being impressed by the analytical and organizational abilities he had demonstrated during the neighbor conflict. Mike's ability to remain calm under pressure and build comprehensive cases for his positions had proven valuable in the corporate environment as well. The financial costs of the conflict had been significant but manageable. Mike had spent money on security equipment, legal consultations, and property improvements, but his homeowner's insurance had covered much of the damage Tom had caused. More importantly, the investment in property protection had likely increased his home's value and prevented much more expensive damage that could have occurred if Tom's behavior had continued unchecked. Mike occasionally wondered what had happened to Tom after he left the neighborhood. The last he had heard, Tom was working as a day laborer for other contractors while trying to rebuild his professional reputation. Mike felt no satisfaction in Tom's downfall, but he also felt no guilt about the consequences that Tom had brought upon himself. The conflict had fundamentally changed Mike's perspective on neighbor relations and community living. He now understood that being a good neighbor sometimes meant being willing to confront bad behavior directly, rather than hoping it would resolve itself. Passive tolerance of harassment and property violations didn't preserve neighborhood harmony. It simply enabled problematic people to continue causing problems for others. Mike had also learned the importance of understanding legal rights and community regulations. Too many homeowners suffered in silence because they didn't realize what options were available to them, or because they were intimidated by the prospect of confrontation. Mike's research into property law, HOA procedures, and harassment statutes had given him the knowledge and confidence to fight back effectively. On quiet Sunday mornings, when Mike was working in his garden and enjoying the peaceful neighborhood atmosphere, he sometimes reflected on how different things might have been if he had handled the situation differently. If he had simply accepted Tom's behavior and done nothing, the harassment would likely have continued and possibly escalated to affect other neighbors as well. If he had responded with anger and aggression instead of patience and documentation, the conflict might have become a mutual battle that hurt both families. Instead, Mike had chosen a path that required more effort and patience but ultimately provided a comprehensive and lasting solution. He had protected his property, defended his rights, and created consequences that would prevent Tom from victimizing other neighbors in the future. The landscape timbers that had started as a simple property protection measure had become symbols of the importance of standing up for oneself and refusing to be intimidated by bullies. As Mike stood watering his flowers that evening, admiring his perfectly maintained lawn and the sturdy timber barriers that protected it, he felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond mere victory in a neighbor dispute. He had proven to himself that patience, intelligence, and determination could overcome aggression and intimidation. He had shown his community that problems could be solved through proper channels and legal means, rather than escalation and retaliation. Most importantly, Mike had reclaimed his peace of mind and his enjoyment of his home. The stress and anxiety that had dominated his life during the months of conflict had been replaced by a calm confidence that he could handle whatever challenges might arise in the future. Tom Henderson was gone, but the lessons learned from their conflict would stay with Mike forever, making him a stronger and more effective advocate for himself and his community.